I believe we can start now. So, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and thank you so much for joining us today for another exciting webinar hosted by the EU Values Network. My name is Emily Jones, and I'm the host and moderator of this session. I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers today, Professor Monica Herz and Giancarlo Summa. They're here to discuss their upcoming book, Multilateralism in the Crosshairs. I will leave them to tell you more about that. But yes, let me first introduce Professor Monica Herz. She's a professor at the Institute of International Relations at Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and a senior fellow at the Brazilian Center of International Relations, among with many other responsibilities and titles as well. Her current research focuses on the flow of weapons in Latin America, regional governance, and Brazilian international security policy. Joining her is her co-author, Giancarlo Summa, who's a former UN director and visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. With extensive experience in Europe, Latin America, and Africa, he served as the UN Director of Information in Brazil from 2007 to 2016. And yeah, we're very delighted to have you both here with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you with your upcoming book. Just to say for all those in the audience, there is a chance to take in a Q&A at the end. You will find this function at the bottom of your screens. So feel free to send your questions as we go, and then we'll do our best to collate and answer those towards the end of the session. So before I hand it over to our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the EU Values Network in case you're new to us. We are a research and education network that brings together 21 higher education institutions from across Europe and around the world, with our mission to enhance debate and deepen understanding of the EU's foreign policy and values. We are supported by Erasmus Plus program, and well, I invite you to visit our website to understand more, subscribe to our newsletter, for example, and you'll find out more about our latest research, blogs, webinars, podcasts. We're doing a lot, so please check out our website. And well, without further ado then, I will hand over to Giancarlo and Monica. I don't know if either of you would like to share a screen, or I'll just leave.
No, it's okay. Okay, shall I start? Yeah, I want to, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of any activity of this amazing group. I will be talking today about a book that you see in the image. It's a book we're launching next week here in Brazil, but we shall also be launching it in English and in Spanish. It is the result of a research program that has been going on for the last 2 years. It involves Giancarlo Summa, myself, Flavia Campos Melo from PUC São Paulo, Andrea Hoffman, that is part of also of this network, also from my institute. It involves a group of younger scholars also that have been doing research together with us. Professor Paulo Esteves, that is not part specifically of this book project, but is part of our group. And we've been engaged in a research on the intersection between the Latin American far right and multilateralism. We detected that although the literature on the far right is very vast at this point, unfortunately, because it is reacting to a very significant reality in national politics. But we also find that the impact, influence, the use of the multilateral space by the far right is still a theme not so much researched. And in particular, the relationship between the far right in Latin America and the multilateral system, we believed was something that needed further research. As a result of this research, or at least an initial result, we are now launching this book that has been partly written by the members of the group, but partly written by colleagues that we invited to be part of this project. And what we tried to do in this book is actually to mix together academic researchers, professors, and a number of activists and journalists. So it is kind of a different kind of book from that point of view. We allow them to write in their different styles as their experience as professionals has produced a different kind of style. So this book starts with a chapter written by Giancarlo and myself, where we try to not define the far right or the radical right, but to point out a number of trends, actually 6 different trends that we find in the practices of these groups. And what I'll try to do just to start our discussion is to point out these trends that we find are present in what is today not only a pattern. We find that it is possible actually to detect pattern of far-right parties and movements, but also a very potent network. And their project, of course, it is different in every country. There are peculiarities in different countries. And these features that we point out have different strength in different countries and movements. Nevertheless, we believe that in some measure, they are found in the movement as a whole. And they impact and are impacted by the relationship between these groups and the multilateral system that was created in the post-Second World War environment and has been changing and evolving ever since. So what I'm going to do just to start our discussion is point out these elements or structures that we find can be treated as a kind of Weberian ideal type, and of course are different in every one of these movements. So we depart from actually the Dutch researcher Moody and his discussion about how the liberal democratic institutions are being treated in a negative manner and are treated and as with great despise by these movements, whether they want to clearly destroy them or not. So that is the first feature, right? This relationship with liberal democracy institutions, a very negative attitude about these institutions. The second element that we find is a rejection between rejection of the association between rights, political, social, economic, environmental rights, gender, sexual, reproductive, religious rights, and more equality, more inclusion, more progress. This association between rights and the elements of some measure of equality, some measure of inclusion, and some measure of progress is a feature that we find very strong and expressed in different programs and projects within the multilateral system. A second element I would like to call your attention to, and this is very, very important, and is related to the kind of nationalism that we see today prevailing in many different countries. And this is a very important element of this discussion because, as others, but this one in particular, it is incorporated by movements, parties, leaders that are not necessarily part of the far right. It is a concept of the nation that involves a homogeneous community and a demand for loyalty to the state that only this state, is capable of representing this homogeneous community. And homogeneity can be defined in many different manners. It may be a language, it may be a religion, it may be a posture, it may be a common past, but this idea that there is a community that needs to find its own idealized, homogeneous feature, we find is present in all these movements and governments, parties. The fourth element we call your attention to is the logic of the enemy. So what we see is that it's as if they took Carl Schmitt's proposal that defining the enemy is a core feature of the political life. These movements focus very much their narrative, their discourse on defining the enemy. The enemy is important because not only it or they or he or she are a threat, but more than that, this enemy needs to be destroyed. So the enemy may be another nation, it may be the left, it may be immigrants, it may be members of a different religion, but the same kind of logic applies. Fourth element I would like to call your attention to is a kind of traditionalism, the treatment of a mythical or idealized past that should prevail, a hierarchy of values where this ideal past is treated as superior. So again, this may be a certain border that in the ideal past was the correct border, a certain homogeneous community, a certain concept of family, the inexistence of certain movements, but this idea that there was a past, and it may be in the 1950s or it may be in the 13th century, that needs to be talked about, that needs to be a reference. And we need rituals to think about this tradition, this past that is being idealized. We need to somehow fight to return. The project, the political project, is a project of return to this ideal past. And finally, and this of course is of interest in particular to me because I work with security and violence, is a kind of reversion of the separation of violent practices in social life. And then you have to, of course, remember that this separation of violence from our everyday lives is very much a feature of modernity. And we establish that there is a monopoly of violence that pertains to the state, or that there are very limited situations in which violence may be used, such as self-defense, and other elements of the use of violence are not considered legitimate. And also, if you look at the multilateral system, very much of what the multilateral system has been trying to do is arms control and disarmament, limit the aggression of foreign policy, limit the use of violence in situations of genocide or disrespect for human rights, or even within the practice of war, as humanitarian law would prescribe. This is all treated for a different way, in different ways, as something that is not that relevant or should be left aside. And the sovereignty of state involves the right to use violence with a lot of liberty, but also involves the use of violence by the individual. The individual, as is very clear in the case of the United States, but this happens also in other countries and happened in our countries in Brazil, the idea that the individual, the use of a weapon by the individual is an expression of his liberty. And he must be able to use this weapon in defense of his liberty against the state, his liberty against international actors or organizations, his liberty against movements that try to limit his own liberties. Because, of course, in a world where rights are being put aside, are being treated as a threat to liberty, we may also use violence to fight this world. So these are features that acquire different strength and different features in each country, in each case. And of course, they are interrelated. We're just trying to separate them in order to make a point of how this transnational network, but also these common features that have evolved during the last years and have, of course, brought back some characteristics of the fascist movement from the 20s and the 30s, are with us and are impacting the relationship between these actors and our multilateral systems. To begin with, now, please, Giancarlo.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Monica. So, as Monica said, we work with a number of people in Brazil, colleagues, friends in Brazil and Latin America and Europe. And the idea of our project is the project is called MUDRAL, so the multilateral and radical right in Latin America. It was to, in fact, study how these far-right actors, which are, of course, more and more powerful in the Americas and in Europe too, and they have an impact. Their concrete actions, either when they are in governments or from the opposition, but they have their actions. They have an impact, a concrete impact at the national level, of course, but also an international level. Which is something that is less studied. This is something that interests me a lot from my concrete experience at the United Nations. I've seen in practice in my work how these far-right actors become, clearly enemies, as they would say, of the multilateral system. The multilateral system is not perfect, of course, but the basic idea of the multilateral system is to use diplomacy to try to find a common ground among different countries, different interests. And along, this almost 80 years in which the current multilateral system was built and worked, so the United Nations and everything else, the idea is that at the core, at everything, there are a number of rights that are inalienable, and that they are rights to which everybody is entitled. So, well, of course, there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations in 48, but the very idea of different rights. So, at the beginning, there were political, social, economic rights, and then the world has evolved, and we are, of course, speaking about and working about gender rights, sexual rights, environmental rights, minority rights, and this very idea of the right to have rights, to quote Hannah Arendt, is rejected by these far-right actors, and this has a clear and dangerous impact on multilateralism, on multilateralist institutions, because these actors, they are in fact sabotaging, they are saboting the whole system. They are doing their best to halt the United Nations system and the multilateral system as a whole, to push forward for the implementation of rights. So we have a number of human rights conventions. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a number of goals in terms of aspiration, and also treaties and convention and declaration that were signed by the countries of the world. And these actors are actively working to destroy this construction. And when I say active is, well, we have seen, for instance, during the Donald Trump's presidency in the near past, that at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Donald Trump administration, they announced that they were going to pulling out from the World Health Organization. So it's, the idea that either this multilateral organization, they do what these far-right actors want, or they must be destroyed in one way or another, or make them incapable of doing their job. This is a process that a researcher, Stephanie Walters, called mass-based destruction, the idea that based on the mass support that these far-right actors have, they do, they work actively to destroy the system. So from within, for being part of the system, doing everything they can to destroy the system. And so we analyzed in this book, I will going into some details now, but so different aspects of this process. And of course, Latin America and Brazil and Latin America and the Americas as a whole, they are unfortunately a perfect case study of everything we are discussing, because as we all know, we had for a few years the perfect storm in place. We had a very far-right government administration in the United States, Donald Trump. We had Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and and the number of far-right actors strengthened. I mean, their presence in Latin America, and December last year, a new far-right president took over in Argentina, Javier Milei. And so, I mean, there is really Latin America is the battleground for, and also perfect, example to be studied, trying to understand better what's going on. So the book is a collection of 13 chapters examining the impact of the far rights on the international system and human rights system, both the international human rights system and the inter-American human rights system, in broader sense. So political, economic, and social rights, gender, sexual rights, environmental rights, minority rights, and so on. As Monica said, it's an interesting mix of, the authors are of academics, researchers, activists, journalists, practitioners. So it's really, I would say we are the editors, so of course we are satisfied with our work, but it's really interesting, the result. And so the different chapters, as the first one, as Monica outlined, Monica and I try to outline the threats to multilateralism posed and global governance posed by these far-right actors when they are in government, but also when they are in the opposition. We, in fact, push governments in direction opposed to rights. Then there is a chapter written by Pablo Stefanoni, journalist and researcher, about the rise of narco-capitalist ideas in Argentina under Javier Milei. The third chapter is written by Stephen Forti, an academic in Barcelona, Spain. It's about the growth and strengthening of transnational far-right networks in present times since the 90s. A few days ago, there was one more example of this growing network of coordinated action of far-right actors, but there was a meeting in Argentina organized the Foro de Madrid with Vox, the far-right Spanish party, and with Javier Milei and the Bolsonaros and the cast from Chile. So it's a very actual and a very sobering reading, but very important. So mapping the transnational far rights network. The chapter 4, written by Flavia de Campos Mello, one of the members of our Multilateral working group, our research group. Flavia is a professor of international relations in São Paulo, at the PUC São Paulo, and so Flavia wrote about anti-environmentalism and the directions of multilateral action on climate change, which is of course one other of the main focus of far-right action. They are, broadly speaking, negationists of climate change, and they work actively to undermine, to destroy the Paris Agreement and any kind of active, policies to curb the climate crisis. The chapter 5. I wrote it with Professor Andrea Ribeiro Hoffman, who also is, member of a Multilateral group and professor of international relations at the PUC Rio de Janeiro University. And this chapter is about the disputes over collective memory related to Latin American dictatorships. This is a new battleground. Far-right actors like Bolsonaro and Milei and others are cast in Chile. They are. There is a active far-right revisionism seeking to create a narrative that minimizes the atrocities perpetrated during the dictatorships in the 70s and the 80s, and often portraying this I mean, the human rights, massive human rights abuses as necessary response to leftist threats or leftist terrorism. And this is not just about the past. I mean, this is a battleground for current politics, trying to shape the global, the national narrative and the the national thinking about human rights using the past, in fact, as a battleground. So there is nothing more contemporary, like I mean, and politically important as history. Chapter 6, it was Monica wrote it. Chapter 6 is about Jair Bolsonaro's foreign policy, which was a radical rightist foreign policy, actively undermining, the traditional Brazil foreign policy, which has been multilateralist since forever. But I mean, the Bolsonaro administration really changed abruptly. I mean, the global insertion of Brazil, and they were very active in creating conservative or reactionary networks to work together within the multilateral system, the United Nations and multilateral system, to attack gender rights, climate change, policies against climate change, sexual rights, and so on. So it was a real a big shift. Going also deeper into this same discussion, there's a chapter written by Jamil Shad, who is a prominent Brazilian journalist, about the instrumentalization of Brazil foreign policies for the global, on behalf of the global far right. So how, I mean, the professional Brazilian diplomacy became part of this global far right network, and also I mean, how they worked to undermine gender equality rights. Another chapter 8, written by Terra Friedrich Budini, who is a researcher and a professor, is about the environmental climate agenda in Bolsonaro's administration. So institutional dismantling and the incitement of violence against environmental defenders. This is part also, it's a very sobering reading. So, but about the attacks on environmental policies and increase in violence against indigenous people and environmental defenders during the Bolsonaro administration. This is also something that, I mean, resonates in what Monica was saying in their introduction, so how violence has become a clear tool, political tool by the far right. So it's not just verbal violence, but also concrete, violence. The chapter 9, written by Daniela Chiaretti, another prominent Brazilian journalist, also is about how Bolsonaro Danielist policy has accelerated Amazon's destruction and turned Brazil into a global pariah. Also, I mean, it's a reading that goes very well with the former chapter was talking about. So it also gives another vision, more in journalistic, so in the corridors of negotiation and so on. But so really how Brazil had during the Bolsonaro years a very a terrible role, I mean, in undermining all policies in this area. On chapter 10, Natalia Viana, another prominent Brazilian journalist, wrote about something very actual, that is the transnational networks that drove disinformation and in the 2022 presidential elections in Brazil, And so the use of fake news, the use of social media as a political weapon by the far right. This is especially important in these days when you all know there is this battle, ongoing battle between the Brazil Supreme Court and Elon Musk about, the use of the former Twitter, now X, platform as a disinformation tool in Brazil. So it's very actually important. The chapter 11 was written by six researchers and activists of the Connectas, one of the leading Brazilian NGOs in human rights, and also about the Bolsonaro government and human rights treatment in the multilateral framework. So this is a very interesting chapter. So it makes an historical panorama, of the evolution of human rights policies, and so, but this is with the let's say activist point of view. So how things changed and what can be done. So, and also a practitioner is the author of chapter 12, Paulo Abrão, who among other things he was the head of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission for 3 years before being sacked on Bolsonaro's pressure. And Paulo wrote about the crisis. The title of his chapter is "Crisis Producers and Resilient Capacities in Human Rights Institutions in the Americas: the Inter-American Regional Space." And finally, the chapter 13, written by Andrea Ribeiro Hoffman and Amanda Cruz, so academics. It's about the centrality of gender among the crisis of democracy and multilateralism. So how, this opposition to gender rights is crucial in the far right discourse, and how, it was carried out in the Bolsonaro's administration. It's a very rich book. Lots of it's a sober reading, I have to say, but it's we are very satisfied because we think we were able to give a clear panorama into giving the big picture, but also going into details on what happened in Latin America in these years. There are, of course, not an encyclopedia. There are, issues that we didn't touch. For instance, we didn't speak about the situation in Central America and Bukele, and so. There are a number of things that are not there, but you must, put limits in a book, otherwise it becomes an encyclopedia, not more books, and also it never ends. But we really are satisfied with this book, which we think will be a useful contribution, not just for academic work, but more, for practitioners too, because in my, and I'm concluding now, in my concrete experience in 15 years as a United Nations communication director, the multilateral system is a target for far right actors, political actors, but the multilateral system and the United Nations, they do not react. First, sometimes they don't understand they are under attack. Just try to survive the day, to live, surviving and fight another day, but there is no real collective reflection and no real countermeasures, put in place, trying to not just, witness what's going on, but trying to influence the results and trying to react to this attack against multilateral institutions, which are now under fire and possibly in their worst crisis in 80 years. So read this book. And now, of course, we are at your disposal to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. That was a really fascinating overview of the book, and it sounds like a super interesting read and kind of mix of quite collaborative work with many different chapters for different people in the audience today. For those at home, to remind you that we do have a Q&A function just at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions, please write those now and we'll be answering them. Monica and Giancarlo, thank you again. You can also see the Q&A box if you like. Otherwise, I will start, take a look and read. There's a question here. So in Europe, there is a significant concern about the Amazon. How much impact do far-right actors in Latin America have on its destruction? Feel free, either of you, to jump in.
I'll start and I'll let Giancarlo continue.
Please.
I think the impact is immense, and to be honest, you just have to look at the data on what happened to the Amazon during the 4 years of the Bolsonaro tenure. I would like to highlight the idea that first, there is this very negative attitude regarding science, and of course the science that has allowed us to understand climate change and the impact on our lives, and specifically the impact on the Amazon and the Amazon's burning impact on climate change. So the first rejection, I think, that is important to point out here is the rejection of science as something that is universal, because anything that is universal becomes a problem. The second rejection is the rejection of international institutions that we mentioned, and the Paris Accords and all the international norms that generate obligations that the Brazilian governments and the Brazilian state has to take into account. Thirdly, there is, because of how much the far right today has attached itself to a hyper-liberal economic policy, but also liberal policy regarding the state more generally. So if the state has to be crushed, it will not have the instrument, the resources to deal with something as grave as the situation in the Amazon. So what we saw during the tenure of Bolsonaro is that very important institutions that are supposed to invest in preserving the Amazon were left to die of hunger. And fourthly, I would point out the fact that there is this idea of the homogeneous community. And in this homogeneous community, there is no room for the indigenous cultures and the indigenous traditions, the indigenous life and history that are protected according to Brazilian law, that need the resources of the state in order to be protected, and that are treated as a menace to this homogeneous community that does not have room for plurality, for plural languages and cultures and manners of dealing with nature.
Very difficult, very sad. Well, okay, we will move on to the second question. Could you highlight how the politics of the memory of the dictatorships has been advanced, for instance, in Brazil and Argentina?
Yes. Well, Argentina and Brazil, we did, a comparative study on this, but of course there is a different history about that. In the sense that Argentina where some of the worst abuses in the possibly worst abuses in the Southern Cone were perpetrated during the dictatorship, and also is the country where the transitional justice were more active. Hundreds and hundreds of perpetrators, human rights abusers, former military, former policemen were at some moment they went to trial and they were condemned. So and also there was during a number of years from 2003 onwards, so during last phase of progressive governments there. I mean, there was really a policy, a state policy in terms of creating a memory of the human rights, the dictatorship. So there was, you know, in a way, with all differences, something comparable to what Germany did in relation to, you know, to Nazism after the Second World War. So the idea, look, this is what happened, it shouldn't happen. I mean, never again, and so on. Brazil, it didn't. I mean, it was much more. There was never the military. The military never suffered any consequence after, you know, the return of democracy. But the point is that in both countries there are these far-right actors that, in fact, were very active in trying to reverse this idea, to rewrite the history and saying, well, in fact, it was, I mean, what the military did, it was right, because there was the communist threat, the left threat, the terrorism, and so on. And this was something from the past, but which has become very present in the political offer. So it's really a cornerstone of the far-right ideology now. It's so in Brazil, Bolsonaro is somebody who, in fact, actively says, well, the dictatorship was right. I would have tortured. I mean, the problem of dictatorship is that they killed and tortured not enough people. That was Bolsonaro. And in the Milei himself, I mean, he's vice president, and now they are, I mean, rewriting the history. They are closing down all the human rights institutions and so on. In the chapter we wrote, we examined a specific episode, which was practically the attack, this concerted attack on the Human Rights Institute of the Mercosur. Mercosur is the trade bloc between Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and now also Bolivia. And so there is a Human Rights Institute, and during the Bolsonaro years, and also during before Milei, for sometimes was a conservative president in Argentina, Mauricio Macri there. I mean, there was a concentrated attack. They slashed funds and funding and so on. And more generally, they try to weaken all the Mercosur process and any kind of integration. So it's now in Brazil, we have a progressive government again, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and in Brazil, Milei, but which means that, in fact, all the integration process of Latin America, also any collective, you know, policy towards human rights is just out of question now. I mean, so we are back to square one, and with this historical revisionism being very, very strong in Argentina. We wrote this chapter at the beginning of the Milei's government. We're just worried for the first signs. If we were to write the chapter now, I mean, the list of provinces is much longer, and I'm afraid that like in Europe, where, I mean, there is kind of normalization of what happened during the Second World War in Germany, in Italy, and in France, where I am now, with, I mean, all the far right that is rewriting, you know, the history and the memory. This is the same process happening in Latin America. We took for granted that, okay, you know, never again. I mean, it's impossible. No, it's possible. And history, you cannot transmit history. So it's a very serious situation, and it's a threat for democracy in the region, because if we don't condemn what happened, it can happen again. And so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think this leads quite well onto a question then from Robert Cohen, who says, Giancarlo, do you see the upcoming UN summit of future as an opportunity to counteract the onslaught of far right?
Well, I will be very quick. For what I read, the Summit of the Future talks about a lot of things. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is trying to find some exit strategy for the current crisis, from a current gridlock. I mean, the blocks of the US and the West on one side, Russia and China on the other. Nothing happens anymore in the Security Council. And so they just had this idea, let's try to find a new common ground for multilateralism. But unfortunately, the discussion about the threat posed by the far right is not there. This is something that, unfortunately, the UN has not been willing to engage with so far. It's complicated because if you do start doing that, you go into internal politics, and this is a kind of forbidden territory for the United Nations system. But at the same time, by not doing anything about that, the UN and multilateral system are now a kind of soft target for all kind of far-right actors. And I'm worried, and everybody's worried, because if Donald Trump is elected in the US in less than 2 months from now, that could be the kiss of death for the multilateral system as we know it today, which the international system, multilateral system, has many faults, lots of faults. Is not as effective in a number of things, lots of problems, but also is the best thing that was ever created in the history of human diplomacy. I mean, trying to find solution. The point is, as I said before, the multilateralism is based on the premises that you can discuss, you must have a dialogue and a negotiation on issues to find solutions, which means also to have some kind of sovereignty, the cession. I mean, you renounce to portions of national sovereignty. Sovereignty is not absolute, because, I don't know, climate change, well, you must have global solutions. And the far right, they just refuse this approach. Sovereignty is absolute. We don't discuss. We do what's best for us, and who cares the rest? So, unfortunately, I'm not very hopeful that the Summit of the Future will give any concrete or useful answer to this threat.
Thank you for that. Okay, a question here from Diego. The multilateral system based on democratically agreed rules is at the center of criticism, but how do we confront the fact that international bureaucracies effectively take autonomy and are responsible for decisions that affect sovereign decision-making? He brings up specifically the case of private tribunals in which countries' disputes against corporations are settled.
Giancarlo, please.
Monica, no, this is for, well.
If you need to read it, because it's a fairly long one, it's in the Q&A under Diego.
Okay. I don't see it in the chat.
No, it's in the Q&A. In Q&A, it's just left to the chat.
Okay.
Fourth down, Diego Yuma, on the multilateral system. Do you see this?
I think in a sense, yes. I think that the area in which you have a greater presence of an alternative proposal concept is regarding gender rights and the family. I think if you look at and we have one chapter actually in the book that discusses very much what takes place in Geneva specifically. Yeah, so I think that in this area there is a whole a greater investment perhaps in terms of redefining what the proper natural family is, redefining what protection of the family means, redefining the whole idea of gender issues in terms of a very strict definition of what a woman is and what a man is. So I think that is the area where you have a more kind of constructive actually investment. So and this called very much our attention at the beginning of the project, and because you have initially the vision that, you know, okay, the far right will try to destroy the multilateral system, or try to make it very weak, or criticize it, or treat it as a threat. And this is all also true. But some investment has been made in terms of this specific area: human rights, the defense of the family, gender issues. Actually, the word gender was not permitted when the Bolsonaro government was in power. So, and for the use of diplomats. So I think that in this area, we see more room for positive, in the sense of constructive projects. And I do also think that more response from societies, that as they become also not only more conservative, but also more religious, tend to adhere to some sort of natural family that should be a reference.
Yeah.
Okay. We have time for one more question. I thought you touched on it a little bit there, but just to expand further if you can.
Yes.
Is the far right actively constructing an alternative set of transnational core values to replace exactly the ones that are the basis for the multilateral system, and also being successful in gaining legitimacy from parts of the population in countries like Brazil and Argentina?
Yes, yes. Well, in fact, there is this ongoing campaign from, so the far right is growing everywhere. We have seen elections more or less everywhere, and even when they don't win elections, they are now, you know, a solid, represent a solid part of public opinion in a number of countries. And this is something that, of course, means, I mean, it's a problem for a number of things, but for multilateral institutions. In the case of Brazil and Argentina, the public opinion is still more favorable in relation to the United Nations. The view they have is more positive than negative. The PW Polls Institute just released a few days ago their annual global poll. I have in front of me. And so in Brazil, 51% of the population has a positive view of the UN against 30%, which is a negative view of the UN system. In Argentina, the number, I mean, the difference is smaller: 42% in favor, 32% with a negative view, and 26% they don't know. So on one hand, I mean, it's pretty clear a number of people, they just don't understand what the multilateral system, the international system is doing in order to improve their life, if they are doing anything. And but more broadly speaking, the public opinion is still more favorable, still have this more open idea. There are a few exceptions in the world in terms of very negative view of the United Nations. Well, Israel, not surprisingly, 76% of the UN, of the population, they have a negative view of the UN, and only 21% a positive view. This is the worst case. But mostly, broadly speaking, in the world, and the medium in this 35 country polls run by PEW is 58% in favor, 31% against. So the battle is not lost, but the problem is serious. And when there is a crisis, and the international community is not, it's not clear what the international system, the multilateral does, in practical terms to help people. This is when you lose, credibility and legitimacy. This is, and so each time that the far right is able to stop good processes, to create more obstacles, to make the system less able to deliver, they are also, they are also increasing number of people who start not believing anymore in the possibility of a multilateral system doing anything useful. So it's really a self-fulfilling prophecy. You stop the system from being able to do their job, and then so people say, well, they are useless. So it's a real complicated thing. In case of and the one thing just we didn't mention before, as you probably, a lot of among you know, the UN system launched these 17 sustainable development goals that for 15 years trying to, improve the world situation globally and so on. And the far right is against this 2030 agenda. So they say that this is a kind of a Marxist conspiracy to assault individual liberties and so on. And they are very active in trying to create all possible obstacles to implementation of, progressive public policies.
Thank you. I know I said last question, but actually there's been a great one that's come through. So we'll end with that, if that's okay. It's from Marcel. He says, looking towards the future, is there a suggested order to tackle rights expansions that prioritizes wealth equity? A lot of the people who vote are poor or feel they are becoming poor, and no political actors so far have gone in help to paint the picture of the obscene magnitude of the great fortunes held in so few hands. Is economic inequality the absolute top issue of them all, say higher than minority protections, gender identification, and others? So either both of you go for that one.
I think what we need to stress is that though the far right does say something important to those that feel excluded both because of their social condition, economic condition, but because they feel they are not being heard. It does not offer any option in terms of the level of inequality in our system. And this needs to be made more perhaps explicit, because what we're looking at is a kind of a Darwinist concept of society, where the fact that there is inequality, the fact that some become very rich and some become very poor, is actually the responsibility of the individual. It's a result of some sort of natural selection, that you are responsible for the level of success or failure that you encounter in your social life, and that this is natural, and it happens in the world of human beings and in the world of other beings. And the idea here is that very much if you have an elite that has a lot of power and a lot of resources, it's because these are very special people. These are people that deserve to be part of this elite. And this fits very well with a certain version of the evangelical right, where especially in Brazil, this is very clear, but throughout Latin America, this idea that prosperity can be explained in religious terms. So it's not institutions, the structure of the economy, the class structure, things that actually we can change in terms of a collective intervention. These things are not available. This is not available. This is the result of the behavior of the individual, of he or her capacity. And it also impacts, I must say, in the treatment of these very charismatic leaders. Why are they leaders, and why do they not have to respond or interact with social rules, with the law itself? Because they are special. It's because their success is a result of their natural characteristics. So I think that very clearly the far right has no answer and cannot have any answer but to reinforce the level of inequality. But of course, the level of inequality and the liberal policies that have produced this level of inequality have also produced the kind of, lack of legitimacy that Giancarlo was talking about.
If I just may add in 30 seconds about this, in Latin America, this to be quick, I will speak only about the Southern Cone. There was what we are witnessing, what we are seeing now. It's kind of a backlash from after 25 years of progressive governments that were more or less everywhere in the region. And in these 25 years, so it's a lot of time, there was, the level of inequalities in the region, they they stayed the same. So poverty sometimes was reduced even in a very important way, but not inequality. So the very rich control most part of the resources or the wealth of the countries, and the poor, they don't have nothing. They are dispossessed. And in this situation where, there is a high level of insecurity, economic insecurity, existential insecurity, what will happen with me and my family and my friends, and what will be our future? And also insecurity in terms of criminality, which is a problem, very serious problem in Latin America. This is very, very, this is open ground for the far right. They have an avenue to grow. And so also what's going on, it's a result of the incapacity of progressive governments to give concrete answers to people's demands, and very legitimate demands.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you. What a great conversation to be a part of. And thank you, everybody, for all your great questions as well. If you have any follow-up questions, of course, please get in touch. And well, to answer another question at the bottom, Robert, yes, this video will be on YouTube in the coming days. So anyone, you can rewatch parts, and we'd love your thoughts and comments there as well. So yes, I suppose for now we'll wrap up, and on behalf of EU Values, thank you so much, Monica and Giancarlo. It's super interesting, and we really enjoyed hearing from you both.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Our pleasure.